Okay, here we are. So my presentation is called Queer Worldmaking as an Approach in Mental Health. I don't know if I'm more excited or more nervous or 50-50 to be talking about my work today, because of course, as you know, our work is always often very personally connected to who we are. So I'll talk a little bit about myself to properly situate myself. This is based on doctoral research I completed in Brussels. This is a photo of me defending my dissertation in Brussels in February. It was quite a profound professional experience to be able to talk about my work and explain my work to a jury. Just to back up a bit. So my name is pronounced Meera Dhebar. I'm situated today in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, colonially known as Lynn Valley, North Vancouver. I live here as an uninvited settler on these stolen lands. I also think of myself as a product of colonization, as my family is from India. My mother is from the Bene Israel Jews in India, and my father is from the Nagar Brahmin caste of Gujarat. I therefore also acknowledge a considerable privilege as a light brown-skinned upper caste cis woman. My pronouns are she, her. I also identify as queer, but must also acknowledge the privilege of living in a North American context, which allows me to have a considerable amount of safety to share and speak openly about my work, my research, and even the ways in which I'm able to practice, which is not something that could happen in many parts of the world. I speak a number of different languages, English, of course. My mother tongue is Gujarati. I speak French. I know some German. This has given me a different window into the language and expression, into the use of language and expression, and how it can be freeing or also very limiting, and especially the influence of gender and pronouns, which is very, very prevalent in most languages other than English. So if you think English is a challenge, you speak any other language and pronouns are assigned to everything. And I don't mean pronouns in a positive way. I mean, everything is gendered. That's what I mean. The table is gendered, anyway, okay. I'll move on. I'm going to talk about my research. What was really exciting about my research and teaching and in my professional practice is I'm always very intentional in hearing from the voices that are often left on the margins. And therefore, I'm always intentionally centering queer of color, Indigenous, and Two-Spirit scholarship and community members in my work, by really questioning how counseling is understood and counseling in social work. I stepped outside of the field into cultural studies, gender studies, diasporic studies, and I was really excited with the ideas I saw around inclusion, visibility, and belonging. And I thought, this is what we need in our mental health settings. These are very different ways of understanding who we are, who our clients are, what it means to be in these communities. You know, one of the first books I read, Gloria Anzaldúa's Borderlands, this is a very well-known book. Anyone I think in gender studies would probably know this, or cultural studies. She talks about being a queer woman, living in Texas on the border of Mexico, and also being an Indigenous Mexican woman, and this experience of liminality. And I think for queers of color, it makes a lot of sense, this feeling of when can I be queer, when can I be racialized? What does it mean to walk in very white queer spaces? What does it mean to be in cultural settings with my family? She calls this liminal space. And other scholars call it a third space or a gray space, but it becomes this other space from which we can see all those other spaces where we have different ways of entering them and being visible. So I love this idea of liminal spaces. I had read another scholars work, Gayatri Gopinath, about diaspora. And what I learned from this is, again, this really disrupting and interrupting this very North American, Eurocentric, Western way of what it means to be queer or trans, and how that shows up when we look outside of these spaces into other places. And so she really talks about region and temporality and how that really informs how we are, how we look, what we look to from each other. And finally, I had read the work of a Two-Spirit scholar, Two-Spirit scholar, Coley Driscoll, who talks about memory. And what does it mean to remember our past and our futures in a way where we always see ourselves as visible, present, and alive. And I just thought this was beautiful. Instead of thinking like, I don't know that there's a history that I'm connected to. I don't know if my people were here. I think colonization erased them. Like a lot of this is true, but maybe we were still always here. What does it mean to think about ourselves in that way? How can it support our mental health? I also, as part of locating myself, I think it's important to talk about my theoretical frameworks. And all of these overlap and touch each other, being relational. You know, of course, we know that from a lot of Indigenous writers and scholars, the importance of being relational. But for how I understand that, being relational means looking at this particular moment. Who is in this Zoom room with me? Who's here? How is that going to inform the questions and the conversation that we're going to have? Simultaneously, who is not here? And what is their absence? How do we understand their absence and what it's bringing and what's missing from our conversation? And I say this to my students all the time. Look at who's here, but forming your social justice framework, who's not here. Social constructionism, you know, I think before I started my dissertation, I read a book by Julie Tilson called Transcending Homonormativity, Therapeutic Conversations with Queer Youth. And I'd never thought of queerness as something that had been constructed, socially constructed. And it was very exciting for me to think about myself in this way. Social constructionism teaches us how language and relationships informs each and every interaction. And the more we can really understand how that's showing up, we can think about what we might want to do differently as practitioners or researchers. Queer theory, some of you may have heard of queer theory. It's very much this anti-identity. I've got some slides that'll look at it a bit more, look at it more closely a little later. But what I learned from queer theory is how to push back against taken for granted assumptions. Don't accept systems and structures. Don't accept what this particular methodology tells you about how you should do your research. Engage with it, but also push back. Queer of color critiques, well, the three that I just mentioned, but that was very important to ensure that experiences of racialization and indigeneity and two-spiritedness were centered in the work. That was really important to me because I didn't want to, otherwise there was a whiteness that was sort of creeping into my work. And so I had to be really intentional in not allowing that to happen. And finally, my anti-colonial stance has been learned by Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars with respect to how they discuss impacts of colonization and what anti-colonial practices mean to them. I've learned a lot from these readings. And I have to acknowledge, of course, alongside all of the Indigenous teachings that I have been grateful to receive, but also Black feminist thought and discourse, and a lot of my work and what I've read is built on this. This is where we've come from, right? And now I'm excited to see where I can take it and where I can go. Okay, in this slide, I want to talk a little bit about colonial constructs. I know I think it's important to always come back to the effects of colonization, but particularly how it affects how we conceptualize mental health, therapeutic practice, and research. So when I think about the binaries of power, I think about how it leads us to these very fixed positions and understanding of sexuality and gender as essentializing, biological, absolute, unchanging. And then from there, we experience power and enforced through this binary discursive positioning of who has power and who doesn't have power, this us and them, the hetero, the homosexual, the white, the Black, the man, the woman. Like we get set up into these binary positions where we are working in opposition to each other. And how do we see that reflected in the work that we do? I like the terms heteropatriarchy and heterocolonialism because that again reminds us of how the legacies of our fields were dependent on these binary gender systems of men having power over women. So this language really signals a very certain framing. And othering, of course, is linked to this. I see it as the social construction of deviant bodies and the hierarchical categorizations of imperialism. This has led then You know, when it was really hard to read about Europe's Enlightenment era. This is a lot of Ken Gergen's work. Europe's Enlightenment era, or the Age of Reason. This is way back from the 1600s to 1700s, but then it started giving us these ideas of who gets to hold knowledge and whose knowledge is valued, and how this shapes psychology in terms of positioning expert and professional knowledge above clients' knowledge of their own mental health. And this, of course, allowed sexual, racial, gender identities to be, again, defined, fixed, devalued, and pathologized. The early discourses of, you know, we know a lot about some of the early discourses of bodies, of homosexual bodies, sexual deviance, racialized bodies, and all the practices that led to that. And if you think about it, that's actually not that long ago. So I feel like a lot of these legacies are still alive. This is what informs these slides, how the framework or the lens through which I have decolonized, I'm actively and constantly working on decolonizing my work and my practice and my readings and how I understand professional practice and research. My next slide, let's see. So impacts in mental health settings, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the initialism, because, you know, I see this and it's always bothered me and I've always wondered why. And the beautiful thing about a PhD is if you're wondering about something, you get the time to research it. You know, we know this initialism as, sometimes it's written as 2S/LGBTQQIA, maybe there's an asterisk, sometimes it's LGBTQ+. We see it in many different forms. It's got value. There's a reason why we need this. It's a reason why we developed it. But sometimes I wonder, is this acronym, this initialism, sorry, how much of it is based on who we are and how much of it is based on who we are not? And what is the value of that? And what I see a lot of practitioners and a lot of my students doing is really focusing on learning the letters and thinking that once I've learned these letters, that's enough. And I'm a competent practitioner or a competent researcher. And I don't know how well that informs our work in a way that can be really meaningful. I'll explain why. The language of competencies is also very problematic because it states once we've read something, we've learned it, we've achieved it. We see the language of competencies in multicultural counseling competencies, cultural competency frameworks, LGBTQ competencies, anti-oppressive practice. I'm really happy that the WPATH guidelines have been revised, the competencies. I'm really happy because it feels like they're less medically focused and far more achievable now. I think what was there previously did not feel like it was attainable, and it was very medically focused. So thinking about learning the letters and the competencies, then I think now we're moving into almost this medical model of treatment, where now we're thinking about the problems associated with holding these identities. And while this is important, and we need to understand them, poor mental health outcomes, lessened access to social determinants of health, it's not something we're treating, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to help a person feel better about homophobia, because that's not possible. And that's why I think sometimes as practitioners, often I'm telling my students, like, I want you to be activists. Like, you're not just therapists, you have to also be activists. It has to inform what you do. But I feel like a lot of the literature that I consistently come across focuses on the poor mental health outcomes and not enough on resistance and resiliency. So when I talk about queer world making, you'll see some ideas of what the idea of resistance and resiliencies could look like. When I think about professional practice and obligations in our code of ethics, particularly in queer and queer of color communities, the language of self-disclosure doesn't make sense. You know, again, self-disclosure connects to objectivity and neutrality, and the therapist with the blank expression, not showing anything, not talking about themselves. I think about how for straight practitioners, they will say, I have to pick up my kids after work, my husband is coming to get me. They have pictures of their family in the background, but somehow when I do it, I'm self-disclosing something. And, you know, why am I expected to be objective and neutral if the other person in that example is not? Oh, it's very dry because it's so hot these days. So I think that that's a challenge of self-disclosure. Instead, I want to learn and teach how we can talk about ourselves in a way that builds and supports the therapeutic relationship. And dual relationships is also this idea of being objective and neutral and being able to keep our work separate, of being able to keep my clients are over here and I don't see them after I leave the office. And then I go to a social space or an activist space or a community space. And somehow there's not supposed to be an overlap. And for most of us here know that is just not the reality. And so why not just have conversations with our clients? I had a conversation with a client yesterday about, summer events and queers and beers. And that's a space that I really like to go to. And so what's going to happen when we run into each other there? We just had a good conversation about it. I'm not going to restrict my access to these spaces, and I don't want my clients or my students to either. We all need to be in these spaces together. Our work is community work. It's not being a professional, objective, neutral practitioner or researcher. Okay, so when I think about what holds communities together, we know for Indigenous identities, the connection is to land. We know that for racialized folks, the connection is often to race, and that's what a lot of identity frameworks are based on. World making in and of itself is not a new idea. I think of world making as how we make sense of who we are, how we make sense of who we are together. But I love in this definition, the idea of not actually having physical space, not having had access to supported families, or coupled relationships to property or to a nation. So if we don't have this physical structure, what holds us together? What does it mean to be in a queer space, event space, or a queer academic space? What is different about that? What holds us together? What is it that we share? We don't share everything. We don't share, we're not necessarily all on the same page politically, for example, but there's something else that brings us together. Another example of world making, I was at the Moving Trans History Forward conference in Victoria in the end of May. And a master's student, I think master's students are so much smarter than I was in my master's. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was just these beautiful presentations. Danny McLaren is a white trans femme scholar from Kingston, from Queens. And their master's paper looked at trans world making through video games as an imaginative, emotive space of creating livable, liberatory trans futures and trans worlds of the present. So here again, we're looking at who we are and how we get to create this space. Their work looked at how this happens in video games, creating safe, restful, revolutionary experiences and spaces, but often centering the dismantling and destruction of systems of oppression that enact violence against trans people of color. And so this creative imagining of new worlds. And I just thought that was such a beautiful way to discuss trans world making through this lens of gaming culture, which I know nothing about, by the way. Something that I hear a lot about, but it's definitely something it was good learning for me to hear this presentation and some of the other ones. I'm reading this book right now and I'm so excited. It's really, really just a beautiful book to read. If you don't know who these two are, Robin Maynard is a Black feminist scholar, does a lot of work in anti-carceral abolitionist work, and had written letters in the pandemic to Leanne, who's an Indigenous artist, activist, scholar, and just this beautiful idea of African Indigenous world making. It's just I can't put it down when I start reading, and they talk about how the interconnectedness of their histories and the connections to land, saying that there's interconnected, interlocking, and also vastly different. So they talk about our world-making projects of abolition and decolonization are enmeshed. A project of world-making intended as radical rupture and anti-colonial struggle. Just a beautiful, beautiful way, again, to think about world making. So coming back to queer world making, how I think of it as a way of understanding, particularly in mental health and research, understanding two-spirit, trans, Indigenous, queer, relational experiences. Again, what does it mean to show up in community with each other, with me? And how we focus away from the body, what it does, what it looks like, and what are the other bodies it's engaging in. I think it's probably exactly a year ago that Jessie Dame was here talking about being two-spirited as a responsibility to community. And Jessie said at least twice, probably 3 times, it's not about the body, it's not about the genitals. And so we can, this framework can also, it allows us to move away from the body. It allows us to move away from the understanding of identities as problem focused. The problem is not being queer, the problem is homophobia. The problem is not being racialized, the problem is racism. So let's move away from how we understand what the problem is and instead rethink our practice, our relationships, and our methods, what we say to our clients, how we show up with our clients, what we do in our work. Let's talk a little bit about queer theory and queering practice. I love the idea that it's an anti-identity. So they're trying to get away from even calling ourselves queer people. They're saying it's an anti-identity, but it's an action, it's a verb. It's about queering practice, queering approaches, queering methods, and particular to psychology, highlighting the need to both shore up and deconstruct. So I love this idea, right? Let's constantly think about how we deconstruct and how we rebuild. In this case, shoring up and also deconstructing identities as stable. Thinking about strategically when we want to talk about identities in a certain way. I have to use that initialum to qualify to write funding applications. So it has a purpose. I have to name myself as a certain way in grant applications. It's not necessarily the way in which I want to talk to others or how I talk to people in my community. We call each other brown people, right? And the proper term is South Asian, for example. So really thinking about how we use language and the essentializing ways, and sometimes we have to use it, and when we choose not to when we're in community. And because different forms and sites of oppression require different political strategies. So being intentional about what you're saying and why, versus thinking you always say it the same way or approach it the same way. I'm going to move to methods now. So here I'm in this process of learning and understanding practice differently, reconceptualizing practice, and then I'm thinking about how I can apply this to research and what it means to queering methods and research paradigm, right? Queer methods, queer theories, or research paradigm consists of a broad system of knowledge reflecting the researcher's worldview and stance. So right in that sentence, we've removed false notions of objectivity and neutrality. So let's really understand my worldview and stance and make it part of how I design my methods. Within research, queer theory is viewed generally as a refusal of traditional methods. Therefore, queer research should not be constrained by particular qualitative methods. And it offers us 4 new ways of conceptualizing the methods. So identifying new types of data, modifying existing protocol, challenging methodological norms, and eliciting pedagogical implications of queer methods. One of my first teachers had said, learn the research methodologies. I'm very visual, sorry, which are in here. I bet you a lot of practitioners have had to look at this textbook. I don't know who Cresswell and Pop is, but they seem to be the ones that are always assigned over and over again in research methods and stats course. I have no idea why. So learn this really, really well, and then look around to things like research as resistance. This is from MSW, research as resistance, critical, indigenous, and anti-oppressive approaches. So what does it mean to first learn the framework, learn the structure, and then question it, and really think about what you hope to do through your research? For me, I thought a lot about my participants and what the experience that I wanted my participants to have. It wasn't just about obtaining and taking data. What did I want my participants to experience? Who were queer color therapists in Toronto and Vancouver. So queer epistemology then is with its transgressive approach to research, it gave me permission to look beyond traditional methods and consider what could really capture complex, layered experiences of queer color therapists. The more I learned about queerness as a worldview, the more I was able to queer my method. I considered how queer identities, epistemology, and cultural knowledge of participants and the researcher could be centered, and then the methods were adapted accordingly. I wanted to create a space where queer color participants could speak openly and that would be conducive to everyone's support and learning. It wasn't just for me, right? It wasn't just for my study, because I feel like then I'm taking knowledge. I wanted them to also have a very fruitful conversation amongst themselves. I took something from narrative practice called an outsider witness team. Sometimes it's called a reflecting team. Vicki Reynolds calls it a solidarity team. And the purpose was to have a conversation with a witnessing aspect to it, which I've done many times in my practice clinical supervision settings. And now I amended it and use it in this setting to collect data. And what that meant is everyone's knowledge was held in a really beautiful way in the room. So I would interview one person and the other 3 therapists would listen as witnesses. When we would stop our interview, we listened to them speak about the impact and influence of what they had just heard. And then we had a larger discussion. Queer worldviews and especially resistance to norms at each steps of data collection and analysis led me to consistently asking myself, how was I using my interpretive lens? So I was always questioning myself. Why was I surprised by this? Why was I not expecting this to be said? Why did I think something would be said in a certain way? I was constantly really questioning myself. So for example, one of the first questions that someone said, one of the first comments that someone said in like minute 2 of my first interview, I'm very nervous, as you can imagine. I haven't engaged in research before. This is my first chance. I'm the first participant. I say, can you tell me a little bit about what queer means to you? And what he said was, I don't like that word. And I don't like labels. And that's a very derogatory word in Spanish and in my country of origin. And it's not a word I like. And I was so flabbergasted because I expected something else to be said. And I had all these emotional responses to me. And then later I thought, okay, this is about holding queerness, even in the absence of comfort with the word. So it leads us to this bigger idea of, again, what it means to sit in community without and navigating language differently, I would say. So what this led to, Travis was saying that he loves the title of my work. So when I call it Queer Love in the Therapeutic Space, if I can bring all of this into my therapy, my supervision, my research practice, if I don't feel like I have to be objective, I don't have to be neutral. I have bias. I'm open about my bias. I've embraced and accepted what my bias is. And I'll pay attention to it when it might show up. I'll note it when it shows up, but I'll think of what impact or influence it's having, or is it having one. I purposely chose not to screen my participants, for example. It was purposely and intentional because I wasn't looking for people who agreed with me. So I actually purposely didn't want to do that. So when I can bring all of those pieces with me, everything I've talked about, self-disclosure, dual relationships, like all of these things that I've been thinking about what it means to engage in queer practice, when I can sit in that therapeutic space with my clients and all of who I want to be and deserve to be and get to be, and I get to see them in that way through this queer world-making lens, I call that's when I get to experience queer love for the work that I'm doing. And I think it's pretty transgressive and revolutionary to think that we could experience love in our work. And I don't know that that's really an idea that people think. What I hear from a lot of new practitioners and students instead is, I'm scared of making a mistake. I'm scared of saying the wrong thing. I'm scared of saying too much about myself. This client talked about this and it reminded me of something I went through and I had a reaction, but I have to hide it. Like, what does it mean if we just look at this as a social justice community counseling space or a social justice infused research space? What does it mean? What are the other languages? What are the other kinds of language or words or concepts or idea that we might get to start using? And I don't know what that is, and I don't need to know. Because as we know from a lot of our social justice and Indigenous and Also from women of color, I've learned this, that the process sometimes is more important, is as important, if not more important than the outcome. So it's not really that we have to get to that end place and have that successful outcome. It means what we did in between in that process, and how we listen to each other, and how the conversations that we were able to have. And so I think that can lead us to a different way of conceptualizing our work. I'm going to stop there. Is there anything else I want to add? No, but I really want to hear questions. I'm more interested in the questions. I don't really like to feel like I'm doing all the talking, because I really am more interested and curious about how the audience is responding and connecting to what I'm saying, and ideas they're having, questions they might have. You know, if I could do this only like one slide and then question and answer, and then one slide and question and answer, to me, that would be a very relational way of giving this presentation, because we would be moving together step by step. Instead, I don't really know what the audience experiences have been in this. So I want to stop here, and I want to start hearing some questions, and then I'm hoping that will really allow us to have a really good, fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dhebar. I'm inspired in so many ways from your talk and from your work. I suspect we'll have questions, and I encourage our participants to enter them in the chat. And while we're waiting, I have a question for you, and you won't be surprised to hear me ask this. I like what you're saying about the limits of the LGBTQ initialism, and I like what you're saying about what queer world making has to offer in a therapeutic setting. And I wonder if you could just help, for those of us who are familiar with this model of care around LGBTQ or 2S LGBTQ affirmation, like help us understand maybe how is that limited? What are we missing if we're just focusing on affirming those different letters in the initialism? And what is radically different about queer world making? And I have some ideas, but I think I'd love to hear you share them with the audience.
Yeah, so we actually have, thank you. That's something I could have made part of my presentation, but thanks for asking the question. So we've got 3 frameworks in the counseling field. And first there was pathology. We know there's a very specific type of framework that was used in counseling. And then we have a period or an era called incorporation, where there is a bit more acknowledgement, moving away just from gay men, acknowledging the experiences of lesbians, and affirming care, which you know, we don't, that's very dated now. It means really kind of affirming who the client is, not really that much acknowledgement yet of trans experiences, but maybe some queer, language of queer is starting to show up in the affirming care framework. And I don't feel it's enough, because I think we have to be very intentional. Often we have to be very intentional about who we are in the room. It's not just affirming and understanding and supporting. It's saying, okay, let's talk about this. Let's talk about this from who you are as a trans woman, from me as a cis queer person. When I ask this question, I know this is the place that it's coming from. What does it mean for you to answer this question to me? Like, it's a very intentional centering of identities and a very specific kind of language of honoring who we are and what we're collaborating and co-constructing and co-creating together. It's very uncomfortable for new practitioners, because what they say is, I'm worried I'm bringing an agenda. I'm worried the client doesn't want to talk about this. I'm worried I'm bringing in something where it's not my place to. And I think this is in the back of our minds. This is in the back. How many times for us as a client in the therapy room are we wondering, does the therapist really understand me? She's this, he's that. This is how they're different. I don't know if they're going to get this. I think they're, so why not just be really intentional and open about who we are and what are all those identities and discourses that are present in the room? So it's a different intentionality. And a different honoring of intersectionality, which hasn't been there till now. So I think there's the intentionality, intersectionality. Oh, I need to come up with another I to make it sound good. Intentionality, intersectionality, and just looking beyond the language that we have access to. Because as we know in mental health settings, there's not always words to describe what we're experiencing. So let's move beyond the limitations of language, which is what trans and gender non-conforming communities have been fantastic at teaching us, the limitations of language.
Thank you so much. We have a few questions coming in through the Q&A, so let me get right to them. And this one is very much related to the topic you were just speaking to on language. AP says, thank you so much for your wisdom, Meera. Could you share an example of what queering a space or process could look like? And they're adding, I appreciate your thoughts on queer not being a static thing, like a noun, but in fact a verb.
Oh, what's the last part of a noun?
Just appreciating that your framing of this is making it a verb. And so I think that maybe is what is inviting the question. So if queering is a process and an action, what's an example of what queering a space or a process could look like maybe in your work in counseling and therapy?
Well, I think the easiest example would be how we already conduct and navigate our relationships, our chosen families, what we choose to do in activist, community, social spaces. I mean, there's something different. Like, I love being in these spaces because when there's not a lot of cis-normativity and heteronormativity, like really being centered, when it's not centered, I think how we feel we can be and what we get to talk about is really different. But I think it's this pushing back. So if my code of ethics has really particular language about dual relationships and self-disclosure, for example, does that mean I have to abide by it? Or if I'm going to queer my queer ethics, Julie Tilson calls it queer relational ethics. If I'm working from that framework, then that gives me access to a whole different kind of conversation that I think I need to have, and that I think is important to have with the client. So I'd say it's a way of pushing back. It's a way of pushing back in a way that centers and understands our histories of having to make our own rules, of having to find our own way, and about trusting that we know how to do this. And it's okay. Those questions, you know, for decades as a social work practitioner in Toronto, I had a lot of these questions. I didn't know how to bring them to the forefront or say them out loud. I didn't feel I had permission. I think that's why I had to do a PhD. So then I could like, okay, now I have the permission to say what I want to say, and I know how to say it, and I'm more articulate now. But I think queering that space just means looking at, why are we doing this way? Why did we decide that we have to do this way? And what makes more sense for who we are and how we would like to do this conference, this setting, this academic structure, this requirement, it's like, let's look at who we are and what really makes more sense to us first, and then seeing what we have to do to meet and fulfill academic requirements, for example.
I love that. That's beautiful, and I think is helpful advice and direction to so many of us navigating these spaces as queer people. There are a number of additional questions, including a few questions about, you know, how do we create and position spaces that are meaning to center queer folks, and so let me just read this first one. So this is in the context of a group about redefining a therapeutic group for redefining joy after experiencing trauma. And the person asking says, what do you think about allowing heterosexual people into the support group that is intended for LGBTQIA+ people? They say they've posted it as an LGBTQIA group, and as of now, they're allowing straight people to attend. And, you know, what are your thoughts on this? And I don't know if your dissertation research got to this point, but I know you've given so much thought to how do you create spaces that are really intentional around identities and experiences, and really being respectful of how that contributes to therapy. And this person is just adding that, you know, maybe there's some ways in which they would ask cis-het people to do certain things or answer questions, or wait to see who's joining the space first, and then maybe undertaking some education. But I can tell they're thinking aloud and wanting you to weigh in on this really important question.
Well, if we think of queering a space as a verb, then can someone who's cis-het also do that? Can they? That's the question. We can invite people in to be allies, but how do we determine or recognize it? And how do we ensure it doesn't limit a conversation that needs to be had? How do we ensure that it doesn't limit a conversation and it doesn't stop centering that kind of conversation? That's what I would say. I think that's a tough question. I would also wonder why the cis-het folks are wanting to enter the space if there's nothing else that's available to them. It's a hard question, but I think, how do we hold what it would mean to invite others into a space as allies, and how would we want to make sure that conversations don't get lost? And I think especially if we're talking about things like joy and trauma, I mean, that even shows up very differently for trans people than cis queer people, right? It's a very, very different experience. So I would just want to make sure that the conversations are taking place that needs to happen. And you would have to be very intentional around how you set that up and what the ground rules would be. But I also, yeah, I think that's a hard choice for facilitators to make or an organization to make. So I'd even wonder why, like, do we have to do this, or can we at least engage in the conversation and not decide that for this set of groups that we don't have to do it, but we're going to at least have a talk about it and then think about it for the next one.
Thank you so much. I'm just seeing a lot of, you know, agreement and curiosity in the chat. So I really appreciate your weighing in on that, Meera, and I'm sure it will be helpful to the practitioner who's asking that. A different question, but also very tied to practice. So a question pertaining to how queering our practice also supports or impacts clients who might not feel like queerness impacts them personally, especially if their identity doesn't align with being queer. So, and they're also asking, you know, largely because society and culture might see identities as concrete and independent from each other, when really we exist within intersectional identities. So how do we open that conversation and approach it? These are big questions, but what I hear, you know, at the core of this is, and maybe even reflected in your study to some extent, where your participants were really reacting to some of these labels. So how do we, how do we queer practice while attending to those sensitivities?
What I did in my study is then I still wanted to, you know, in the absence of that word as a label, I still wanted to get underneath. Tell me how you've come to conceptualize your practice. Tell me about the different clients that you've worked with. My questions didn't change that much. What I learned from this particular participant who had said this was, you know, they shared some really powerful stories of doing a practicum, for example, in a site that focused on addictions and really feeling like false or fake or an imposter for not coming out. It's like I really felt badly because I didn't feel safe or comfortable to do that, especially when I had clients who were straight men. So there was something he wanted to do. He didn't like the word, but he still wanted to be able to show up in a certain way. And so that's why I think we can work around language. If it's not about the words, we can talk about the experience. And some of the other things that he told me was that, it's a very bad word in Spanish, but that my participants, the study group in Vancouver were Latin gay cis men. They talked about what it means to be safe in Canada and culturally free in their countries of origin. So you know, like I can, if I could choose to go back home, I would, but it's not, I wouldn't be safe from violence there. So here I can live my life in a certain way with my partner, raising a child together. I can do these things here. I couldn't do it back home, but I miss the cultural safety that I had. So it becomes holding these without using that word as a label. So I think we just have to inquire differently. Coming back to more specifically the question for someone who says it doesn't impact them personally, I might just say, well, tell me about how your identity, your relationships, just tell me how you navigate that and how it shows up in different parts of your life. Like if you're on a soccer team, or if you're in your professional world or your academic world, like just what are the different ways in which you feel you get to be who you want to be. You get to show up in the way that's important to you. I always often talk to my clients about what it means to stand up and make noise, be seen, be heard, be loud. That gets at some of the same ideas, I think, without using the word as a label. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really inspiring, actually, to take the values and principles behind the concept without being overly focused on the word, which people, of course, will have different reactions to. I want to share there's a lot of people appreciating many aspects of your presentation. Meera, one participant saying thank you for making this point about the importance of honest language in our writing, and who had a very similar experience in an academic piece of writing. And one of our colleagues here at the center saying, this is a beautiful presentation about transformative approaches to both practice and research, which I think is something that I really saw beautifully done. So thank you for your clarity and modeling. Coming from Dr. Vedam, another Brown clinician, midwife, and health equity researcher. Nikki says, thanks so much, Meera. It's so great to see what you've been working on all this time. Wave, hello, hi, Nikki. Wondering if you could talk a bit about how folks navigate doing this work within colonial systems of care that privilege the medical model, white supremacist and capitalist ways of working.
Thanks, Nikki, for asking me a really easy question. I think we have to find our ways. We have to find our ways. A good example is, because I've worked in BCH, was, for example, far before I started doing any of this, and the ways that we're told to chart about our clients, for example, right? To me, which is it's all those things. It's very colonial. It's very it's claiming objectivity and neutrality just because we're saying the writer saw. There are a lot of problems, for example, in the charting. And so if I was there today, I would probably push back and say, what is it that's needed? What is the purpose of this chart note? What do I want to accomplish? What do I want to carry? What would the client be okay to know that I'm saying about them? So I think finding our ways to meet the most basic of expectations and requirements and criteria, but then finding the ways in which we want to use language and finding those little ways to push back. Now, a good example is in some literature, it says that when I'm very critical, for example, of intakes and assessments. And when you're new, when you're fairly new, what you do is you follow the questions and the question answer, and you're writing them down. And how do you get to that place where you make it a conversation with the client? And you fill out the form later. But then some literature says that it's not okay to say to the client, I just have to ask these questions, so let's just ask them and get them out of the way, that it's actually not conducive. But I think, what does it mean for the client to have a good experience and feel trust with the practitioners and professionals they're having to engage with? I don't know if that's answering your question, Nikki, because you're pretty outspoken in really beautiful ways, right? And so I don't know if that helps answer your question, or if that's a new idea or things you're already doing. But how do we distinguish between what we have to do and what we think is important to do, and find a way to hold those voices? That's what I would say. And if I was back in those settings again, I think I would write my notes very, very differently. I don't think I would write them, in my notes now, even the way I write my notes now, I never write my assessment, my intervention, nothing. It's not about me. My notes are about the client and what they told me they're going through. It's not about what I think. So I would do those things differently, is what I would say, if that's a useful answer to your question. I think also, before we could even do that, I guess we have to know what they are. We have to name the structures. We have to name them for what they are. That's why, when I was preparing this presentation, I was like, should I go through this again? But I think it's important because they're always there, and they're very sneaky. They're always sneaking up on us and influencing our work in little ways. So I think it's good always to have these reminders. And sometimes there's some new aspects that can be learned. We have to keep actively listening and learning about the ways in which these constructs are showing up, so then we know how to actively work alongside them. You can't really work against them unless you leave the job. So then how do you work alongside them? But I think you have to know what they are first and recognize them, and then find your ways. All of you, find your ways to do the work the way you think makes sense.
So thank you for that, Meera, and for that great question, Nikki. We have time for one last question, which, sorry, give me 1 second here. I'm navigating too many windows. So someone has asked a question that I think probably is on a lot of people's minds, which is, what if someone's new to this concept of queer world making? Where can they start learning? So I'm wondering if you have the names of, you gave us some in your talk, but I wonder if you could remind us of the names of some of the people that we should look to and maybe read or listen for, who can help people really get immersed in this queer world making concept.
Yeah, I do have some references that I prepared for everything that I was naming today, and I forgot what we're doing with them. I can't remember if we're emailing it or making it available somewhere. I can't remember, but I had prepared 2 pages with some references, but someone has to remind me what we're doing with that document.
Okay, well, I will invite my brilliant, amazing colleagues at the communications team at the center to chime in the chat to let us know where we're going to make those available. But let's just say those are coming, and
I have them.
will make.
I have them.
Yes, thank you so much. So I want to be mindful of folks' time, and I want to really take a moment to appreciate just exactly what Dr. Vedam said, really transformative ideas and approaches that I think beautifully move between research and practice. And you've offered us so much to think about and take back to our own work. So I want to thank you so much, Meera.